And in feudal Japan, nothing was higher than the law. They were not spared. They were not forgiven. They were ordered to commit seppuku themselves. 46 of them died by their own hand on a single day. Honor didn't save them. It didn't grant them a happy ending or a return to their status. It simply gave them a cleaner way to die. The concept was called renzoku, joint responsibility. If one person committed a serious crime, their entire household, often even their extended family, could suffer brutal retribution. This wasn't about finding accomplices, it was about ensuring absolute control through shared terror. The consequences for an innocent family could be horrifying. Families were exiled, stripped of their land and banished from their village, left to starve as hainin, non-humans. Homes were destroyed, often burned to the ground, erasing any trace of the family's existence. Children were enslaved or killed, the most extreme punishment, particularly for crimes against a lord or the shogun. A child could be sold into servitude or executed simply for being born into the wrong family. Why such extreme measures against the innocent? Because loyalty to family was supposed to be the strongest bond. The state believed that if you couldn't control your relatives, if you couldn't instill enough fear or loyalty within your own bloodline to prevent them from committing a crime, then you didn't deserve mercy. In fact, you deserved to be erased. Imagine making one mistake, stealing a handful of rice to feed your starving child, speaking a careless word of dissent, or simply being accused falsely, and knowing that your children would pay the ultimate price for it. That overwhelming fear shaped behavior more effectively than any law book. It ensured absolute compliance not just from individuals, but from entire family units. Popular culture, especially in the West, often portrays samurai as noble protectors, paragons of virtue, always ready to defend the weak. The reality was far, far darker. The Edo period was a time of relative peace, lasting over 250 years. This meant that millions of samurai, traditionally warriors, suddenly had no wars to fight. Many were underpaid, frustrated, and bored. Their martial skills were stagnating, and their financial status was often precarious, especially compared to the rising merchant class. For some, their status became their only currency, and violence became a way to assert it. Here are documented cases, even in the peaceful Edo period, of samurai testing new swords on random commoners. This practice was known as tsujijiri, literally meaning crossroads killing. Imagine a samurai, perhaps drunk, perhaps simply irritated, walking down a path. He feels insulted by a peasant who doesn't bow quickly enough, or he simply wants to test the sharpness of his newly acquired blade. He draws his katana and cuts the peasant down. While officially illegal, enforcement of tsujijiri was inconsistent. Unless the commoner had a powerful lord who cared, which was rare, or the samurai caused a widespread panic, investigations were often perfunctory. If you died quietly, in the dark, no one investigated too deeply. Your life simply ended, a statistic of the street. This wasn't about justice, it was about privilege and power. A samurai's honor, fragile as it was, could be asserted with a single stroke. Your life, however, was cheap. If guards roamed the streets at night with torches and bells, why does darkness still belong to fear, violence, and silent death in feudal Japan? If you were robbed, beaten, or assaulted under the cover of night, justice was a ghost. Unless your attacker threatened the broader social order or the shogun's peace, crimes against commoners were rarely prioritized. And if you dared to accuse someone above your class, that accusation alone could be considered a disruption of harmony, a crime punishable by death. The law didn't need proof to destroy you. Records from the Sengoku period describe the terrifying speed of total justice. In one documented case, a village was merely suspected of hiding bandits. The response was absolute. Crops were burned to ensure starvation. Wells were poisoned to kill the survivors. The village itself was erased as the survivors were scattered or executed. There was no trial. No evidence. Just suspicion. The smoke from that village traveled faster than soldiers ever could, sending a message to every other town: in this world, innocence is a luxury, and suspicion is a sentence. If birth itself could mean death, disease, or abandonment, what chance did a child truly have to survive in feudal Japan, where childhood offered no safety, mercy, or protection? In a world where food was limited and land was taxed so heavily that farmers often lived on the edge of subsistence, another mouth to feed wasn't just a blessing, it could be a death sentence for the entire family. This harsh economic reality led to a practice that most romanticized histories of the samurai era conveniently omit: Mabiki. Literally translated as thinning out, a term usually used for seedlings in a field, Mabiki was the practice of infanticide. Unwanted infants, most often girls or those born into families already struggling with a bad harvest, were quietly killed or abandoned shortly after birth. While the shogunate eventually issued edicts against it, the practice was often met with a silent shrug by local officials who understood the brutal math of the village. Families didn't necessarily see this as an act of cruelty; in their eyes, it was a desperate act of survival to ensure the children already living didn't starve. If you were born weak, female, or during a famine year, your chances of seeing your first birthday dropped immediately. If you survived infancy, the struggle didn't get easier. There was no childhood, as we understand it today, no period of protected play or developmental freedom. In feudal Japan, a child was simply a small adult in training. By the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to the household survival. Their days were filled with carrying water from distant wells or rivers, watching younger siblings while parents worked the fields, foraging for firewood or wild greens to stretch the meager rations, running errands for village headmen or local shops. By the time a child reached 10, they were often laboring full days. The transition from play to work was abrupt and absolute. Education, while more common in Japan than in many other contemporary societies, remained strictly class-based. Samurai children attended henko, domain schools, where they mastered reading, calligraphy, and the martial skills required of their rank. Common children, if they went to school at all, attended terakoya, temple schools, where the curriculum focused on the basics of the abacus and, more importantly, the virtues of obedience and endurance. In feudal Japan, children did not belong to themselves. They belonged to i.e., the household. In a society where survival was a razor-thin margin, children were viewed as assets, and sometimes, as collateral. Under the law, parents had nearly absolute authority. To settle a crisis, a family could sell children into servitude, sending a daughter to work in the pleasure districts or a son to be an indentured laborer. Send them to temples, often done with younger sons who couldn't inherit land. Give them to other families, using a child as a human repayment for a lingering debt. This wasn't seen as an act of cruelty, it was a legal, socially accepted strategy to save the rest of the family from ruin. A child sold into service might never see their home again, and no law required kindness from their new master. The myth tells us that ancient Japanese women were always fragile, respected ornaments. The truth is that their worth was tied strictly to their utility. Samurai women. A samurai woman's life was defined by the 3 obediences: obey your father, then your husband, then your son. While some were trained to fight with the naginata to defend the home, this wasn't about empowerment, it was a duty to die for the household if necessary. Peasant women. If you were a peasant woman, your life was a marathon of labor. You worked the fields alongside the men, managed the cooking, spun thread, and raised children simultaneously. Peasant women often gave birth in dirt floor huts without medical care and were expected to return to the rice paddies almost immediately. Many died young. Their strength was required for the nation to eat, yet their suffering remained invisible. Merchant and artisan women. In the bustling cities, women had a bit more visibility, often managing the front of house for family businesses or handling complex finances. Widows might gain temporary independence to run a shop, but the shadow of male authority was always present. Remarriage was often forced to keep property within a specific lineage. In every class, freedom was fragile. If marriage decided our fate, status, and survival, Why was control held by one side alone, and why could only one partner walk away in feudal Japan? Marriage was purely transactional. It was a contract designed to secure political alliances between samurai clans, to produce male heirs to carry on the family name, and, for the lower classes, to manage agricultural labor. Consent was not required. Girls were often married off in their early teens, transitioning from the authority of their fathers to the absolute authority of their husbands. A wife's primary duty was simple: obedience and fertility. Failure to produce a male heir was seen as a failure of the woman alone. It could lead to immediate divorce, abandonment, or the husband bringing in a concubine to finish the job. In this system, a woman's worth was tied directly to her womb. If a marriage was failing, the exit doors only opened from the outside. A man could divorce his wife with startling ease. He didn't need a lawyer or a judge, he simply had to issue a mikadarihan. This was a 3.5-line letter stating his intent to dissolve the marriage. Once written, the woman was cast out, often disgraced and unable to return to her original family. But for women, the options were almost non-existent. A woman could not simply leave. Her only hope was to reach a divorce temple, kakekomidera, like Tokiiji in Kamakura. These were rare Buddhist sanctuaries that protected abused wives, but getting there was a gauntlet. A woman had to physically enter the temple grounds, sometimes literally throwing her sandal over the gate while being chased, to claim sanctuary. If she stayed for 2 to 3 years, the marriage could be legally dissolved. But for the vast majority of women, these temples were too far away and too difficult to reach. Endurance was the only path. Beyond the marriage bed, the reality was even darker. Sexual exploitation was not just common, it was normalized and regulated. Servant girls in samurai households were completely vulnerable to the whims of their masters. Concubines were a standard status symbol for the elite, creating a complex hierarchy of official and unofficial children. Prostitution was a massive, state-sanctioned industry, heavily taxed and confined to pleasure districts like Yoshiwara. During famine years, the most vulnerable, children and the elderly, were sometimes abandoned in remote areas to save the remaining family. This practice, known as abusive, abandoning the old, is debated by historians as a widespread custom, but famine records are clear: families were forced to choose who lived and who died. Romantic stories avoid this desperation, reality doesn't. Justice was equally indifferent to gender. Women were not spared from the state's theater of fear. They were publicly humiliated and paraded through streets. Beaten and executed for theft or dissent. Punished for their husbands' crimes under collective responsibility. Sometimes, they were killed by their own families to erase dishonor. Their suffering was public, instructional, and permanent. If cherry blossoms symbolized beauty and peace, what darker truth of death, duty, and suffering did feudal Japan hide beneath them? Between 1467 and 1603, Japan did not experience conflict, it experienced a total breakdown of civilization. This era, the Sengoku Jidai, Age of Warring States, saw over 200 daimyo fighting simultaneously for territory and survival. There was no unified army. No Geneva Convention. No protected civilians. Power shifted with such violent speed that villages sometimes changed rulers 3 or 4 times in a single year. Historical tax records tell the grim story: entire regions lost 30 to 60% of their population to the combined forces of blade, famine, and displacement. If you lived there, war wasn't a news report, it was your environment. You lived inside the fire. Let me tell you real story of the Onin War, 1467 to 1477. The chaos began not with a grand invasion, but with a political dispute among elites in Kyoto. It ended with the near-complete erasure of Japan's cultural heart. Kyoto, the once magnificent capital, burned for 10 long years. Contemporary accounts describe a hellscape. Entire districts reduced to ash as wooden palaces and temples fueled the flames. Bodies left in streets to rot because there were too few survivors to bury them. Refugees fleeing into the countryside, only to meet bandits and starvation. A monk of the time wrote that the capital had become a city of ghosts. This war didn't end with a formal treaty, it simply burned itself out until there was nothing left to fight over.